Where was the English Civil War won? Was it on the battlefield at Marston Moor or Naseby? Was it in the banqueting house when King Charles I had his head cut off in 1649? Or was it here in central London, at this place? This is the York Watergate on the Embankment, and it's all that remains of what was once a fantastic palatial residence in the mid-17th century. It used to sit right on the banks of the Thames, and there are paintings that show the water lapping up to these steps right here. But now, because the area was embanked in the 19th century, it's about 150 foot away from the Thames itself, stood here on its own in the Embankment Gardens, somewhat disregarded, though it still looks pretty cool. So this here was built in 1626. It's a fantastic Italianate design, and it was created by George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, who's become famous recently as one of the characters in the series Mary and George. Obviously, he spent a lot of money having this built. Now, the Watergate isn't in great shape these days. Those lions at the top seem to have fared particularly badly from weathering, though the pigeons still seem quite happy resting on top of them. You can see the coat of arms of Buckingham, and you can see the very ornate designs along the columns. But still worth looking at. Now, George Villiers was not a particularly popular figure amongst lots of people. He was a favourite of the king and was deemed to exert undue influence. That influence continued after the death of James I, when Charles I came onto the throne in 1625. That meant that in 1628, Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, was assassinated. In the 1640s, as civil war began to boil up between the royalists and parliamentarians, this place became important because it passed into the hands of a certain Earl Algernon Percy, who was the Lord Admiral, and he was on the parliamentarian side. Got to imagine that behind this gate, there wasn't the office blocks and coffee shops you can see there. There would have been a grand palatial residence, really grand, full of amazing artworks. There was an inventory in the 1630s, and the artworks inside were remarkable. So this was a really posh place. Eminent people would arrive by boat and get out here and then progress into the property. So in the 1640s, some interesting and important things happened in the house that used to sit here. In 1642, the embattled King, Charles, had decamped his court to Oxford, which kind of left London open to the parliamentarians. So in 1644, this place was the venue of a meeting of the Committee of Both Kingdoms. The kingdoms in question being England and Scotland, after the parliamentarians here had done a deal with the Scots. And those committee meetings were crucial in the way the Civil War ran out. I spoke to the historian John Adamson about this, and he told me one of the great turning points of the war was the creation of the new model army and the amalgamation of existing armies to form a single, highly effective and politically controlled fighting force. And the key meetings that produced the plan for the new army and much of the political manoeuvring to create it were actually in York House and its nearby neighbour, Derby House, of which now not a stone remains. So that's what happened here. This is where the parliamentarians decided on the format of their military force. The decision of the Committee for Both Kingdoms to set up the new model army was crucial to the outcome of the war. In February 1645, the army was set up under the generalship of Sir Thomas Fairfax. The aim was to create a highly disciplined professional fighting force. And it worked. The newly formed and freshly trained army recorded a significant victory over the Royalists at the Battle of Naseby just a few months later. The further victories of the new model army in autumn and winter 1645 eventually led to the surrender of King Charles in 1646 and the end of the first bout of hostilities in the Civil War. So the question is, what would have happened if Parliament hadn't set up the new model army? How different would the course of the English Civil Wars have been? According to John Adamson, things could have turned out quite differently. If there had been no new model army, there would almost certainly have been no definitive victory over the king, no move towards the radicalisation of politics in the later 1640s, and a very different set of outcomes to that great decade of political and military conflict. According to another eminent historian of the Civil War, Professor Mark Stoyle, Parliament could have won without the new model army, but probably wouldn't have done so as swiftly. So the Watergate today stands in the middle of the rather nice Embankment Gardens, some distance from the Thames, as I said, and it's really, for most people, probably just an elaborate garden ornament. Sat over there in the corner, not really being looked at very much, which is a shame. And what you need to imagine is the Thames in its original position flowing along here, and the great grandees of the parliamentarian forces, Algernon Percy, Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell himself, stepping out of their boats and going up through that gate to make these key decisions. So sadly I can't replicate the experience of of Cromwell and Fairfax and Percy of arriving by boat and going through this gate for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the Thames isn't here anymore, and secondly, they stuck a great big metal grille in the way. I can, however, walk around the back of it and head up to Buckingham Street, which is where I am now, and obviously this is where the palace itself would once have stood. No longer here, fine townhouses, office blocks and coffee shops. But it was here where these significant moments were decided. So although this once fabulous piece of architecture is now a little bit past its prime, and the house it used to serve completely absent, the story it tells is still a remarkable one and worth thinking about. What would have happened if those meetings had not occurred here in the 1640s? Would the outcome of the Civil War have been rather different? Or would a king still have lost his head?